Imagine the sound of wind cutting to the desert like a sharpened blade, carrying names no one should speak anymore. Now imagine a mother hearing that wind every single day, for 25 years, waiting for it to bring back what was torn from her. This is a story about loss. It's about what happens when faith transforms into something dark, when institutions that you protect become prisons, and when decades of silence finally break in a way no one expected. What would you do if your children simply disappeared inside a system everyone calls sacred? What if, a quarter century later, you discover they never left that place, but in a way that would forever change your understanding of what really happened behind closed doors and adobe walls? Because sometimes a horror isn't in the monsters we invent, but in the institutions we build and call holy. It was 1938 when Inez Bluebird did what thousands of other Native mothers were forced to do: hand over her children to a Catholic boarding school that promised education, integration, a bright future. The boys had names that told stories: Nantai, the one who walks ahead, and Chaska, born at dawn. Inside that freshly painted building with immaculate windows, those names were erased, replaced with simplified versions that fit bureaucratic records. The braids were cut. The family's language was forbidden. Their eyes were trained to look always down, never forward. And Inez, standing at the fence with her hands gripping the wire, watched her sons transform into something she didn't recognize. Small statues of silence lined up like window displays of a future that would never be theirs. She visited once a month, always on the second Sunday, and with each visit she noticed something different disappearing from their eyes. First curiosity, then hope, finally the very idea that there existed a world beyond those walls where they had once been free. Then came that autumn morning when photographers from the Capitol arrived with their heavy cameras and notepads, saying they wanted to capture progress, the future, transformation. Inez stood at a distance and watched Nantai and Chaska on the chapel steps, motionless under the sun that bit their eyes, while a priest held a book and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was something about that priest she couldn't name, something in the way he positioned the boys, as if they were objects instead of people, something in how his hand hovered over their shoulders without ever truly touching, as if contact were contamination. The next day, the dormitories were emptied in silence. Transfer, they whispered. Selection for a special program. When Inez knocked on the administration office door demanding answers, she received paperwork with words that explained nothing and a look that said everything without needing sound. Don't ask, don't insist, don't come back. The wind changed its voice that afternoon, and for 25 years she would hear it repeating the same two syllables like a mantra of agony. Come back, come back, come back. But there was something else she didn't realize in that moment, a detail that would only make sense decades later. The priest in that photograph had a birthmark on his left wrist, small and dark like a frozen tear, and that mark would appear again in her life in a way she could never imagine. Can you imagine what it's like to search for someone the entire world insists you forget? Inez spent years attending fairs, train stations, Sunday masses, and Tuesday funerals, always with her eyes scanning crowds for two details only a mother would notice: a slight deviation in Nantai's nose, broken in childhood during play at the frozen creek, and a birthmark behind Chaska's ear, small as a seed. She learned to read bulletin boards, to talk with truck drivers, to recognize the tracks of diocese vehicles in the dust of back roads. She collected newspaper clippings where boarding schools posed clean and organized, always with the same optimistic caption: integrating the Indian into modern life. In each photograph, her eyes traced every face, every shadow, every detail blurred by cheap printing, but she never found what she was looking for. She began keeping letters she wrote but never sent, addressed to her sons in places that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed, letters where she told them about the changing seasons, about the creek that dried up and ran again, about how the house seemed too big and too quiet without them, until that summer of 1963, when something shifted and she realized that perhaps it wasn't just the boys who had been taken, but also a part of herself that had been buried along with hope. That's when a flyer appeared folded under the door of her small house in Red Mesa, a simple paper announcing a healing and intercession retreat promoted by a group called Brothers of the Immaculate Heart. There was a hand-drawn map, arrows indicating a pilgrimage that would pass through pueblos and small parishes in New Mexico, an invitation to bring intentions because God, according to them, always answers. Inez hadn't attended Catholic churches in a long time, preferring to pray the old way, with blue corn and songs her mother taught her, but something about that flyer touched her deeply. Maybe it was the irregular handwriting of whoever noted the schedules. Maybe it was the two small crosses drawn in the margin, or maybe it was just the wind pushing once more, insisting she couldn't stop searching. But there was something more, something she would only realize later. The ink used on the map had a slightly bluish tone, identical to the pen the priest in that old photograph carried in his habit pocket. And that couldn't be coincidence, could it? She borrowed a pickup truck and drove to the church indicated on the flyer, arriving on an afternoon when the stained glass painted the floor with colors that seemed both promise and warning. If you believe stories like this should be told, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. At the altar, a young priest spoke about faith and obedience with the conviction of someone who never had to question what those words really mean. But what captured Inez's attention were the 5 figures in dark habits who remained at the side, heads bowed, motionless as statues. They called these men brothers, but their faces had the color of that region's earth, high cheekbones, deep eyes that reminded her of the children from the boarding schools. There was something disturbing about the way they moved, or rather, the way they didn't move, as if they had been trained to occupy as little space as possible, to exist without bothering anyone, to breathe without making noise. Inez stayed in the back pew, hands closed on her knees, ready to leave as soon as Mass ended because this seemed like just another disappointment in a life full of them. But then, already at the door, something made her turn her face. It was a sound, almost imperceptible, like the cracking of bones or the dragging of chains, coming from the direction where the brothers gathered. One of the brothers carried a box of intentions and limped slightly as he walked. The habit caught on his face with a draft and revealed, for just a second, a thin scar crossing his right eyebrow. Inez's heart exploded in her chest because she knew that mark, had seen that scar form when Nantai was 6 years old and fell in a frozen creek near his grandmother's house. But the side door closed before she could call out, before she could be certain, before she could breathe. Have you ever felt that moment when time seems to stop and accelerate at the same time, when you know something impossible is happening, but you can't fully process it? That's exactly what Inez was experiencing in that instant. And there was more. When the brother turned his head, she glimpsed for a split second his eyes, and in them there was recognition, a spark of something that could be memory or could just be the desperate reflection her own hope projected onto a stranger. She ran outside and saw the Brothers of the Immaculate Heart getting into an unmarked white van, taking the dirt road toward the hills where the sun was already beginning to descend, painting everything red. Inez started to pick up with trembling hands and followed them, keeping a distance that wouldn't raise suspicion, her heart beating so hard she could barely hear the engine. The wheels bit gravel for almost an hour, passing landmarks she recognized from her old searches, places where she had stopped to ask, to show yellowed photographs, to beg for information that never came. And now, following that anonymous van, she felt as if all those small failed searches had been necessary steps to arrive exactly here, in this moment, on this dusty road that seemed to lead to the end of the world. Until a simple gate emerged from the dry brush. A tall fence, prayer flags improvised and tied to wires, a small guard booth. There were no church bells, no well-tended garden, nothing that suggested a place of devotion, just straight, rough walls like a warehouse or a prison. And on those prayer flags, handwritten on faded fabric, were names, dozens of them, some she recognized from other families who had also lost children in the boarding schools, names no one spoke anymore because it hurts too much to remember. A native young man signaled for the van to enter and looked around with suspicion that made Inez's stomach turn. She parked far away, hidden behind twisted shrubs, and waited until darkness swallowed the edges of the courtyard. The gate closed with a contained metal sound, the kind of sound that seems to say no one enters and no one leaves. And for a moment Inez wondered if she was going crazy, if 25 years of searching had finally broken something inside her. She could have left at that moment, should have left, but the wind pushed again, and she found herself walking around the fence, testing the ground with her toes, looking for a crack, anything that would give her a view of what was inside. Her fingers found barbed wire, and she felt the cold, rusted metal bite her skin, leaving small scratches that burned, but she barely noticed because all her attention was focused on deciphering the shadows moving beyond the fence. Through a narrow opening, she saw a cramped courtyard and two figures in habits walking side by side, one of them wiping his face with his sleeves in a gesture that seemed to carry so much exhaustion it almost hurt to watch. Before she could make out who they were, a third figure without a habit, wearing ordinary clothes but with something authoritative in his posture, hurriedly guided them inside one of the buildings. And then Inez saw something that made her blood freeze. Hanging on the exterior wall of the main building, partially covered by dried ivy, there was a framed photograph, large enough to be seen even from a distance. It was the same photograph from the steps, her sons under the merciless sun, the priest with the fake smile. But now, seeing that image in that place, she understood it hadn't just been a propaganda photo. It had been a catalog, a showcase, a way to mark who was available for whatever happened inside. Inez backed away, blood thundering in her ears, and when she finally caught her breath, she returned to the pickup and drove to the nearest town. She looked for the police station, but found walls with crucifixes and faces that didn't want to hear what a native woman had to say about men doing holy work. The sheriff didn't even look her in the eye when he said she was confused, that those brothers did holy work, and that she shouldn't even be lurking around private property. But there was something in the way he spoke, a brief hesitation when he pronounced the word holy, as if even he knew that word didn't fit that place. Inez left without arguing, because anyone who lived through 25 years of empty answers learns to save their breath and spend it where it might bear fruit. Have you ever felt completely invisible, as if your words didn't have enough weight to even move the air? She went to the gas station payphone and called an old contact, a teacher at the tribal college who sometimes helped families decipher papers and stamps. She explained everything, every detail, every suspicion, and on the other end of the line the silence stretched so long she thought he had hung up. Then he said something that changed everything. "I know that place. Other mothers have talked about it, but no one has ever been able to get inside." Within hours, 2 tribal police cars arrived discreetly, engines still warm from the climb up and down the mountains, and the oldest one, a man with a calm gaze and broad hands, said only, "Just show us the way. The rest is on us." They didn't turn on sirens, didn't knock on the front door, didn't announce their arrival. They entered through silence, the same way the boys had been taken years before. Inez stayed in the darkness, behind a thicket, with her nails marking her palms as she waited, praying silently with words her mother taught her. The gate creaked, voices whispered orders, hurried footsteps crossed the courtyard, and then came sounds she recognized from when her children were babies. A contained cry, a scream tried to be small and failing. Someone saying, "Breathe, breathe, breathe." But there were other sounds too, sounds she didn't expect, like the dragging of chains being loosened, the crackling of papers being hastily collected, and voices shouting in panic trying to destroy evidence it was already too late to hide. When the gate opened again, 2 stretchers emerged carried by paramedics, moving with the urgency of those who know every second matters. On one of the stretchers, a thin, worn man, skin marked by lines of time and violence. lifted his face toward the wind, as if feeling fresh air for the first time in decades. The scar on his eyebrow gleamed faintly under the headlights, and Inez didn't remember running. Only realized she was beside him when she felt the rough texture of the habit and the bittersweet smell of cheap wine and old incense. She touched the scar with her fingertip, like someone recognizing a signature in the dark, and whispered the name no one had spoken in 25 years. Nantai. He closed his eyes like someone being born again, like someone who can finally rest after a war that lasted a quarter century. But when he opened his eyes again, there was something in them Inez didn't expect to see. Not just relief, but also guilt, a guilt so deep and corrosive it seemed to have carved holes where there once was soul. But then Inez asked the question every mother would ask, the question she knew she had to ask, but was so afraid of the answer. And the other one? The agent's exchange that look people who work with tragedies develop. And the oldest spoke quietly, with a respect that acknowledged the weight of what he was about to say. We found a second habit and a place in the courtyard, unmarked, with stones piled up. There are internal records we'll need time and experts to fully decipher, but it appears the younger one didn't leave here. The night tilted. The wind that always spoke seemed to stop to listen, and Inez nodded once, just once, like someone recognizing the truth even when it comes broken into pieces that will never fit completely back together. Nantai's hand sought hers and stayed, and in that grip was contained the entire story that still needed to be told. But there was something more in that grip, an urgency, as if he was trying to transmit a message his words couldn't yet form, a warning about even deeper secrets waiting to be discovered. In the regional hospital, under white lights that had the gift of revealing and concealing at the same time, doctors treated old and recent wounds, washed alcohol from blood, removed leather strips that had stuck to skin as if they were part of it. Nantai slept for hours, a heavy sleep of someone who hasn't truly slept in years. And when he finally opened his eyes, his mother was in a plastic chair, holding a brown envelope with documents the tribal police had obtained that very dawn. It was a transfer list from 1938, full of signatures that didn't match, handwritten notes with phrases like good for obedience, quiet, useful for internal services. Phrases that transformed children into tools, into objects, into something less than human. And next to each name were codes, numbers corresponding to values, as if each child had a different price depending on how broken they already were when they arrived. The oldest agent pulled out another sheet and explained what they had discovered, and each word was like a stone falling into a bottomless well. They turned faith into a machine, he said. They mixed prayers, wine, and distorted native rituals to extract responses from people. They called it intercession. Some benefactors paid for this, paid well. Important people who would never set foot in that place but knew enough to benefit from a myth, from the supposed spiritual connection those men and habits supposedly had. And whoever didn't see anything during these forced rituals, whoever didn't produce the visions the pairs expected, got beaten until they saw, until they pretended, until they broke completely. Can you imagine what it's like to turn faith into torture, to use the sacred as an instrument of violence? There were ledgers detailing each session, each client, each payment, and some of the names in those books were people society respected, judges, businessmen, even other members of the clergy who came seeking visions about important decisions and didn't care about the price others paid for these supposed divine revelations. Nantai looked at his mother, and for the first time since the chapel steps, for the first time in 25 years, spoke fully, with a voice that seemed to be reconstructed word by word. I tried to protect Chaska, he said. When he got sick, I begged them to take him to the town doctor, but they said pain purifies, that God answers faster when it hurts, that suffering is the path. One day he stopped hurting, stopped breathing, stopped everything. And I stayed because there was nowhere to go, because I didn't know if he were still looking, because I thought I had failed to protect him, and this was my punishment. But there's something you need to know, something they did that's worse than you imagine. He paused, his eyes searching for strength to continue. They didn't choose just any child for that place. They chose twins, siblings close in age, children who had strong bonds with each other. They said the connection between siblings made the visions more powerful, that one suffering amplified the other's spiritual sensitivity. They used us as instruments, as human antennas for whatever those rich people wanted to hear from beyond. Inez leaned over him, forehead touching his, and said nothing because there was no sentence that fit that moment. There was only presence. There was only the wind outside bending prayer flags tied to wires. There was only a mother and son rebuilding a connection that should have been broken, but somehow resisted 25 years of separation. In the days that followed, the investigation brought everything to the surface like an old wound finally being cleaned. Forged documents showing transfers that never happened, a burial courtyard where children were marked only with piled stones, accounting ledgers with generous donations from people society respected, names of important people who knew exactly what was happening but chose silence because it was more convenient, more profitable, more comfortable. The diocese rushed to say they were unaware of the excesses, using that soft word as if it could somehow minimize decades of systematic abuse. The sheriff who had told Inez not to ask avoided cameras and reporters as if deliberate ignorance were a defense. And that gate without bells became a national headline, a symbol of something that had happened on a much larger scale than anyone wanted to admit. But the most disturbing discovery was that this wasn't the only place. The accounting records revealed transfers to 3 other similar locations scattered across the Southwest, all operating under different names, but with the same structure, the same macabre purpose, the same elite clientele paying for visions extracted from the suffering of native children. The following Sunday, Inez returned to the same church where she had seen the habit fly and revealed a scar that changed everything. She didn't go to thank the institution that stayed silent when it should have screamed, that looked the other way when it should have investigated, that protected its reputation instead of protecting children. She went to thank the wind that pushed, the intuition that insisted, the strength that kept her searching when the entire world said to give up. She lit 2 candles, one for the son who returned carrying scars that will never completely disappear, another for the child the earth kept and whom she never got to bury with the dignity he deserved. Instead of memorized prayer that meant nothing to her, she whispered her grandmother's ancient song, named the water, the stone, and the morning, asked that the path finally erase the footprints of fear and leave only those of return. And as she sang, she realized other women had silently entered the church, mothers she recognized from her old searches, women who had also lost children and who now came because finally there was a place to put the pain. Finally there was confirmation they weren't crazy, that their children really had been taken, that the silence hadn't been accident but conspiracy. Outside, she sat on the steps and opened the brown envelope she had been carrying. Among papers and stamps, there was a yellowed photograph an employee had given her almost by accident. 2 children on the steps, sun in their eyes, hands on their knees, a priest behind them pretending a future he knew would never happen. Inez folded the photo carefully and kept it in her dress pocket, like someone keeping an old map that despite being wrong, despite being false, despite everything led to the truth. Because sometimes the path to truth passes precisely through the lies that try to hide it, and you need to cross through darkness to fully understand the value of light. But then she noticed something she had never seen before in that photograph, something that only now, with everything revealed, made sense. In the window in the background, partially hidden by the curtain, was the silhouette of another child looking out, and in that child's eyes, even blurred by the poor print quality, there was an expression Inez could finally name. It was absolute terror. It was the knowledge that something terrible was about to happen. It was the last image of someone who knew there was no escape. 25 years after that day when the wind changed its voice, the discovery wasn't a miracle in the sweet, comforting sense people like to imagine. It was an open cut that finally received air, a wound that had rotted in the dark, and now could begin to heal even though the scars would be permanent. One son alive, carrying the weight of a quarter-century of survival. Another made sacred in stone in an unmarked courtyard where children were discarded as if they didn't matter. The wind spoke again, this time softly, like the murmur of a house that is people again after years abandoned, and each time it passed through Red, Mace it left in the air a simple promise that only mothers and those who were saved understand. Some disappearances don't end when the person returns. They end when the truth is finally spoken aloud, when names are pronounced again, when the silence that protected the guilty finally breaks. Inez stood up, dusted off her dress, and walked slowly to the hospital room where Nantai was still recovering. He slept with a tranquility she hadn't seen since he was small, before the boarding schools, before the transfers, before everything. On the bedside table, 2 small candles improvised in metal lids burned without sound, a constant reminder that even in the deepest darkness there is light if you know where to look. The mother pressed her forehead to the window glass and looked outside. The desert breathed long and deep, as if it too had waited 25 years for that moment, as if the very earth recognized that something had been corrected even though it could never be completely repaired. And in that moment of quietness, she thought about something Nantai had said the night before, something he whispered when he thought she was asleep. They said we were the last ones, but I heard names of other places, other children, other siblings. The investigation may have ended here, but the story doesn't end. Not really. Because how many other gates still exist closed, protecting secrets no one wants to admit? And as the sun began to rise, painting the sky with colors that promised a new day, Inez thought about all the other mothers who never had this discovery, who never knew what happened to their children, who died with the wind still whispering names that never received answers. She thought about how many courtyards still exist without markers, how many stories are still buried under piled stones, how many truths are still waiting for someone brave enough to search even when everyone says to stop. This story ends with a reunion, but how many others are still waiting to be told? How many winds are still speaking names no one is hearing? And what do we do with this truth now that is before us, impossible to ignore, demanding we look directly at it even though it hurts? Because the real horror isn't just in what happened, but in knowing it might still be happening. Somewhere we haven't found yet, behind doors we haven't opened, in silences we haven't broken.